Namaste, myself Treni Purana, Assistant Professor, Faculty Physiotherapy and Diagnostics, JVM, Rajasthan. Today we are going to discuss about history and examination as pattern for pediatrics. The history and examination of a child requires a blend medical diagnostic skills to establish or confirm the diagnosis as well as knowledge of the child development and behavior to evaluate functional assets and challenges for the intervention phase of rehab. First, setting the tone. To ensure the best cooperation, especially in the preschool age, the environment should be child friendly. Exposure to crying and upset children should be avoided in the waiting room or other areas. Families will do better if someone else can take care of child's siblings rather than bring them to the appointment so that parents can focus on the interview without distraction. The examination room may have a small table and chair with an assortment of toys for children of different ages to make them comfortable and relaxed. The examiner's attire also influences the child. Many times a good rule is to lose the white coat unless it has a pocket full of toys. The child is not impressed by the coat and may be intimidated by past medical visits. A child-oriented doctor, such as pictures of cartoon characters or animals on the wall, small toys and decals on instruments help to create a playful atmosphere and alleviate a child's fear. Start the visit by introducing yourself, including telling the patient and parents something about yourself and what will happen during the visit and how long it will last. Ask the parents to tell you why they came and what specific questions they have for you. Concerns stated by the referral source should be shared with the parents. Many parents are unsure about what information the visit can provide. This is the opportunity to explain what pediatric rehabilitation is, its focus on function, and what it can offer the child and family. The examiner should also explain that it is a part of examination to watch the child so that the parents will not feel offended by the examiner's wandering gaze, because observations of spontaneous behavior is one of the most informative aspects of evaluating youngsters with a disability. Examination begins from the moment the child is in the physician's view. Questions about history and illness should be asked in simple terms so that the family can understand them and provide proper information. It is also important to have someone clarify insurance coverage and whether additional tests or treatment can be performed on the same day or must await approval. Now, taking prenatal and perinatal history. Prenatal and perinatal history includes the preconceptual period and the parent's age and health before and since the birth of the child. Maternal factors during gestation may lead to fetal malformations. Example, febrile illness, anticonvulsants with spina bifida, maternal diabetes with caudal regression syndrome, sacral agenesis, rubella, thalidomide, or fetal alcohol syndrome. Weak or eventually lost fetal movements may be the earliest sign of a motor disability of prenatal origin. Prenatal care, unusual weight gain or loss, hypertension or any other gestational problems should be explored. Mode and duration of delivery, use of anesthesia, induction, intrapartum complications and expected and actual date of birth should be noted. The developmental history should cover all major aspects of function and behavior. Delayed accomplishments, primarily in motor function, suggest a neuromuscular deficit. One of the earliest signs that parents report is a lack of spontaneous movements when the infant is held or placed in the crib. They may add that the baby feels limp or stiff, suggesting either hypotonia or spasticity. In all cases of motor dysfunction, it is important to clarify whether the dysfunction was a steady, continuing delay from an early age, suggesting a static disease, or an arrest or regression noted at a particular point. However, slow deterioration due to progressive neurological disease may be masked for a time by the relatively fast pace of early motor development. Developmental history and subsequent assessment must take into consideration the interactive effect of coexistent deficits. Slow development in personal and adaptive tasks that require both motor and cognitive abilities may be related to impairment in either area. A significant cognitive dysfunction by itself may delay gross and fine motor development. This also frequently exacerbates the functional consequences of neuromuscular disability and may create the impression that the motor deficit is more severe than it actually is. History of delaying communication development raises several differential diagnostic possibilities. True language dysfunction affecting receptive or expressive domains, or both. Oral motor dysfunction interfering with speech production, significant hearing loss. In a child with motor disability, language dysfunction may result from the diffuse or focal cerebral lesions such as head injury or cerebral palsy, particularly when cognitive function is also affected. The ability to follow simple and later complex commands indicates preserved receptive language even in the absence of verbalization. Parents report a variety of responses such as smiling, cooing, crying, pointing, or vocalization with inflections as a substitute for speech. Oral motor dysfunction is also associated with cerebral palsy, most often with spastic quadriparesis or dyskinetic disorders due to suprabulbar or pseudobulbar palsy. Bulbar palsy is medullary involvement, affects speech production, example in spinal muscular atrophy or spina bifida with syringobulbia. There is a close association between autonomic structure and neurological control for speech and oral feeding. Concurrent oral motor function or dysfunctions with feeding difficulties is an additional sign of bulbar or pseudobulbar pathology and confirms the suspicion of speech production deficits. In such cases, history of early feeding is most relevant. Example, was there a good lip seal and strong suction on breastfeeding? When bottle fed, the infant can handle 4 ounces in about 10 minutes and feedings every 3 to 4 hours are generally adequate. The need for longer and more frequent feeding to maintain weight gain, especially during the first few months. Coughing, nasal regurgitation of liquids, and then later difficulty with drinking from a cup, and difficulty with introduction of solid food due to chewing problems are early symptoms of motor dysfunction and a possible subsequent deficits in speech production. Augmentative communication training should be initiated early in such cases. Now, what is about hearing? Hearing is an essential factor for speech development. Early cooing and babbling are innate characteristics of infants and involve the same vocal components regardless of the language spoken in their environment. Infants with hearing loss start to fall behind after 6 to 8 months of the age and learning of auditory dependent vocalization begins. Parents may notice a decrease even in spontaneous babbling at that age. All neonates and infants at high risk for development disability or recurrent ear infections should have an initial and, if warranted, repeat hearing evaluation. Correction of a hearing deficit should be initiated as soon as possible after it is detected. For infants and young children, the history is obtained from parents or caretakers. While gathering information from one person about another, the examiner gains an understanding of both and establishes rapport with parent and child. Early school age children can provide some information about themselves and should be encouraged to do so. Pre-adolescents and particularly adolescents generally prefer to give an account of their problem and achievements. Adolescents may wish to have privacy without the parents present, at least for part of the visit. Now let's see about the general health history. The examiner should determine whether the patient is an essentially well child with impairment or a sick child who has been hospitalized several times. In the latter case, one should explore in detail the frequency, reason, tests, and treatments. Even if one has access to records, the parents should be asked to tell the child's history in their own words. Their account provides as an insight into their knowledge and participation in the child's care. One should ask how many visits they make to medical centers and therapists and how much time is spent in transit for the child's care. History of allergies to medication or substances should be noted. An early history of allergies to different and often inconsistent formulas may indicate that the child is in fact had feeding difficulties that were attributed to allergy. Multiple exposure to latex and any signs of allergy should be determined, particularly in spina bifida or after repeated surgeries. Any medications that the child takes regularly include dietary supplements and homeopathic and alternative medications or aerosols should be recorded with dosage and schedule. The risk and incidence of seizure are higher in static and progressive diseases of central nervous system. Overt or suspicious signs, types and frequency of seizures, anticonvulsants and their effectiveness and possible side effects should be recorded. Nutrition with special consideration for the child's disability should be reviewed. Feeding difficulties or behavior problems may lead to inadequate consumption of calories and essential nutrients. Dietary intake may be lower than required for the increased energy expenditure on physical activities in children with motor disability. In contrast, caloric intake may be excessive when physical activity level is restricted and lead to obesity. Commonly in wheelchair users with spina bifida or muscular dystrophy and after transition from walking with assisted devices to mobility via wheelchair. In children with caloric restriction, there is often a need for supplemented vitamin, protein and calcium. Dietary information and guidance are fundamental for regulation of neurogenic bowel incontinence. Cultural and family eating patterns should be taken into consideration. Injuries, burns, fractures, and spinal cord and head trauma are followed by a period of catabolic state. Monitoring of weight, nutrition, and fluid intake is essential during inpatient rehab for major injuries and after return to home. Caloric requirements for children are calculated from age appropriate standards which take into consideration growth. In children with motor disability, upward or downward adjustment in height and weight may be needed depending on their level of physical activity and individual growth trend. Specific recommendations are available for children with spina bifida to avoid obesity. Obesity is a risk factor for secondary issues from the primary diagnosis including pain and fatigue as well as cardiovascular risk and social challenge. History of respiratory complications, past or present, should be explored in children with patent diagnosis. Central ventilatory dysfunction is a potential severe complication of Arnold-Chiari malformation in spina bifida. Syringobulbar may cause similar symptoms. Nightmares, insomnia, and night swelling are complaints associated with hypercapnia and may be reported in advanced stages of muscular dystrophy. Hypercapnia and sleep apnea may occur in diseases of CNS. Intercostal muscle paralysis in high thoracic paraplegia with spinal cord injury or spina bifida. Spinal muscular atrophy or advanced muscle diseases leads to inefficient pulmonary ventilation and handling of secretions. With severe spasticity or dyskinetic cerebral palsy, the respiratory musculature may lack coordination. Such children are prone to recurrent bouts of pulmonary infections. Coexistent feeding difficulties with minor aspirations or restrictive pulmonary diseases due to spinal deformities may add to pulmonary dysfunction. Thank you.